So welcome to the promo video for mine, Metanomad, and Matt Colquhoun, Xenogothic, the course, the Philosophy and Politics of Accelerationism, which is a course we should be releasing this Friday coming, which is the 24th of July 2020, if you're watching this video a long time from now. So this is going to be sort of an hour-long promo, just chatting about accelerationism, what we were hoping to achieve with the course. So I'll start just by briefly saying that my philosophy lectures I'm doing, and Matt's doing the politics lectures. The philosophy lectures are largely based off my thesis, Accelerationism, Capitalism as Critique, but they do serve as a big expansion on that, especially with regards to desire. So the philosophy lectures are sort of underlying the philosophical process and what we mean when we say accelerate the process. And I'm sure there'll be big connections to Matt's work. But Matt, huge question. What were you sort of trying to target with the politics lectures?
Yeah, I feel like for me, especially, and I think maybe for everyone, when it comes to talking about politics of accelerationism today in 2020, there is the long shadow of a lot of the quite horrible stuff that's been done in its name in more recent years. And I guess my starting point was to think how a politics of accelerationism can sort of stand on its own 2 feet with that association, and what happens, that how it got from a sort of blogosphere point of niche philosophy and politics, even more so than it is now, and then end up with sort of mass shootings. And so my half of the course is just basically new research for me, is that the initial moment of emergence for accelerationism seemed to be regarding what Alain Badiou called a crisis in negation. Everything that initially emerged from the blogosphere before any of the publications came out in sort of the late 2000s was talking about how we escape this moment of apparent cultural and political stasis, and avoiding what Deleuze and Guattari call that process of deterritorialization and the inevitable re-territorialization. And what became quite ironic to me in researching this was that the sort of far right accelerationism that we've seen in the last few years, that's depending on who you are, has kind of dealt a fatal blow to this conversation, is just resembles, for taking this long perspective, looks like this sort of re-territorialization. It is turning accelerationism into the very thing it first set out to critique. And a lot of people have said that online in the aftermath. And I guess this course just goes deep and tries to excavate what that means. It shows the receipts, basically, for that claim.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a real inherent problem with the sort of white suit. Every time accelerationism is mentioned in the media now, which is increasingly, it's a lot. It's turning up time and time again as sort of a signifier of like radical right-wing terrorism, basically, or it's sort of the new equivalent of a more extreme fascism. And I guess for any of those following the news, their definition seems to be that accelerationism is They've made a sort of, for me, a transcendental mistake in that they're understanding accelerationism just from phenomena. So they understand accelerationism basically as people who want to accelerate the worst parts of society, so society just crashes and burns. This is the mainstream media's definition of accelerationism, and one of the real inherent problems is that we can't actually ignore this definition because it is still part of the process. So like Nick Land says, who's sort of ironically called the father of accelerationism, even though he is right wing, which doesn't help matters. The point is that what comes from the actual transcendental process of accelerationism can still be said to be it, but it's a symptom. So it's like, well, it's interesting to look at the way in which accelerationism is evolving, but whatever caricature it takes in that moment, that isn't it in its substance, in its essence. That isn't it completely. So it's like, yeah, it might be this now, but that's a symptom of something happening on a far deeper level. So what is it?
Yes.
what is it that led people to want to push things in this direction, and why is the underlying direction taking it to this point? Whether or not that point is like ideologically charged isn't really the point with respect to the actual process. The process is how and why are things moving, and in what direction are they moving. So it's sort of just a confusion of confusing like what's going on at a societal level with what's going on underneath that, which is sort of the difficult thing, because if you're not philosophically literate, shall we say, then you're never going to get to that level. And I'm hoping that our course will sort of say, look, here's what it was before it got sort of tarnished, because obviously something so controversial and like an absolute stoppage, like no one wants to sort of, when you have something so abhorrent as right-wing terrorism and a shooting, no one wants to be the person to say like, let's look at this in a different light, because you instantly come across this kind of like, hang on, are you sympathizing with it? It's like, no, but when we strip away the aesthetic here and what's going on at societal level, there's a point that we were talking about years and years ago, which has now been overtaken because this thing is so monolithic that you don't, people hand it with kiddie gloves because they don't want to go near it. But it's like, that isn't really what it is. But, it's always the horrible thing to say is like, when you start saying that isn't what it is, you're coming across as someone who's like, I know what accelerationism is. And I think we're trying to finally outline the beginning points, I think. So, yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, that's what I found really interesting in going back right to the beginning. Because I always had at least in terms of its blogospheric emergence, I always just had this idea that accelerationism kind of grew out of what was called hauntology, and it was kind of a reaction to it. So Mark Fisher writing about hauntology on his blog in the mid-2000s, and then there was a backlash to that, and then accelerationism kind of emerged as this new revitalized thing. And it's interesting to think of it like that, because what seemed to happen with hauntology was that you had this group of thinkers online that were responding to something that they were seeing at a social level. As you say, like, this sense that nothing culturally new is being produced. Why is this? Is that just a superficial reading, or is this a symptom of something deeper down? And then you get this weird irony where the very people that a lot of these writers are talking about, who they see as sort of like, they describe as hauntological, a lot of them just assume that what this blogosphere is doing is just compartmentalizing their cultural activities and sort of trying to, hauntology is not just rather than being like a kind of symptomatology of our cultural postmodern moment. It's just another way to, throw a novel new genre at something that's trying to stay clear of this kind of capitalist process of appropriation. Which, the great irony of that is that, hauntology then becomes seen as the very thing it was trying to critique. And it's kind of interesting to see that happen. And then accelerationism basically did the same thing. And it's not to say that this new far-right accelerationism isn't accelerationism. It's just like the meeting point of this Ouroboros process. It's the starting point biting the tail. And that in itself, I think, that's that seeing that culturally, I think, makes it easier to apprehend what's happened at a kind of cynical and cyclical capitalist level. But that in a way, that image, I assume, is a great starting point for getting into actually a lot of deeper philosophical questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that Nick Land does outline in a quick and dirty introduction to accelerationism, is that the very nature of accelerationism is, if you think you've caught the thing, if you outlined, like you said with the Ouroboros there, if you outlined the head biting the tail and said that's it, that's the final loop, it's like no, you've found one iteration of this process. What we're trying to do is go one level deeper and say, where's this process come from? What is it that's pulling the strings of the process in itself? Any sort of symptoms or reactions or emanations that come from the process are certainly interesting to look at. You could sort of say, well, why did that happen? And draw it back and say, or this is happening with a process, this got reterritorialized, or things along these lines. But if you take one of those as the definition of the whole system itself, then you're going to get very muddled. And I think this is sort of the big problem is sort of especially with the aesthetic of accelerationism. Something we chatted about briefly before we started this. It's like with the aesthetic of accelerationism and the attitude and the culture, which is certainly very clear. It's sort of very highly online at the moment. Big influence from 90s cyberculture, very sort of accelerative in the actual traditional definition of like techno-economic SpaceX, just bring everything new in. And that attitude, which sort of came around with the beginnings of accelerationism as a very coherent, relatively coherent idea in 2017, people still see that as the attitude and the culture of it. But it's like, well, no, but that's there certainly because the actual process of accelerationism is this extremely, it sounds dumb, but accelerative thing. So you sort of, people, I think, locked onto the social culture which was closest to an understanding of that. So it's like, what's the culture we know, which is, super fragmenting, super atomized. And that's why I think it's adhered to a sort of very highly online, just atomized culture where you sort of feel like you have this freedom to just go down any avenue and accelerate it and go into the most sort of deep Ballardian depths of accelerative absurdity. And I think that's why that's why it adheres to the most radical notions of everything it touches, is because it does accelerate it. So it's never going to be part of some sort of relatively calm system, because the very nature of it is always going to push it to the point where something almost breaks and you've reached the point of like, wow, that really is radical. But the problem is at that point is when it sort of dissipates and goes off somewhere else. And this is sort of the process of schizophrenia with Deleuze and Guattari, which I touch on. So yeah, I don't know if that comes up in the politics lectures.
Yeah, I mean, not so in the background for sure. I mean, I certainly don't go so deeply into it because these are kind of things that I'm gladly, rightfully assumed that you're covering in your size. And I guess it's interesting. This is why I find it interesting the way that we've done this. In terms of you two covering philosophy and me covering politics, is that what I've found in my side is that those, in a lot of ways, the very question for politics, the politics of accelerationism, is why is there a distance, or how do we correct this distance between philosophy and politics? The politics can be just brought down to the question of what is to be done. We have this, we've diagnosed this problem. We've seen, to some extent, the deeper machinations of it. So what do we do in response, if anything? And the way that question then becomes removed from philosophy, in the sense that, I think that's kind of and I've heard some people talk about the sort of right wing, the far right, calling it far right, I almost feel like it's better to call it like a 4chan accelerationism. Be honest about where it's emerged from. But in a way, it's like that. I've also heard people call that like a non-philosophical accelerationism, which I find like an interesting thing to call it, as if to say, does that mean it's purely political? But then, to what extent is there even a politics there if it's not informed by some sort of deeper analysis of what's going on? So it's that, again, it's also that sense of to what extent that distancing of these two things is also part of this process that is being that we're trying to critique, this accelerative process. As if to say it's sort of like a G-force thing. Like if you put two things in a fastly a fast spinning sort of, I don't know. I've just got the vision of like a roundabout in my head, of like a kid with a moped wheel stuck on the side. You sit two people either side of that and you attach a moped wheel to it. They're going to fly off in different directions. And part of the politics, I think, deals with that quite explicitly. So yeah, you get that kind of schizophrenic sense of it's easy to gather a schizophrenic understanding of things there. But again, yeah, I guess my side, it's more of like, what's the actual experience of that beyond the deep down sort of philosophical analysis? What does it actually feel like? But yeah, the impact of that process, like at a sort of material, like, or even like, I guess what does that mean in immediacy? Is one question too that I think my side wants to ask. What is immediacy in a Marxist sense? Being, the that which is immediately apparent to us, and to what extent is that immediacy more or less an illusion? Yeah, I guess it's that metaphor in that sense, of like what's the material outcome of this process that makes us feel wholly out of control, and yeah, what if anything is there to do about it?
What's interesting that you outlined there is one of the really interesting things about accelerationism with regard to the politics and with regards to the philosophy is that there's this sort of strange moment where all politics combines in that all sides are agreed upon one thing, which is like, we're not going in any direction that any side wants. So like, Nick outlines this as well when he says that capitalism is this system that no one really wanted in its current form, but it's what we've got. So it's like, we're not moving in an actual conservative direction. We're not conserving anything. We're not moving in a communist direction because, well, I'm sure you can comment on that great than I can, but it doesn't seem to be that we are. We're not moving in a fascist direction. But at the same time, there seems to be tiny snippets from each of these being used sporadically in random places, which is the really interesting thing. And I think that it's that problem of something that is actually connecting all of these in the problem of stagnance, which is where it connects to the philosophical. Because the philosophy is about how, on a philosophical or specifically transcendental level, do limits get broken, and do we break into other things? And it's this problem of, well, what if there is something such in the example of accelerationism, which is capitalism, which can adhere to all systems at once? And this is like the big problem, right?
Yeah. The one thing that is kind of the main background for my side of the course is basically Marxism, but also kind of crises that have happened within Marxism. So yeah, talking to the point of if is there any possibility that we're heading towards communism? In a way, that's also one of those early accelerationist questions. For Marx, the assumption was that capitalism will inevitably lead to socialism or communism, because it can't help but this was, again, when Badiou talks about a crisis of negation, he's talking about what Marx calls the negation of the negation. And Marx talks about this in terms of like individual property. So feudalism completely abjures the sense that anyone can, the proletariat especially, can own their own home. And then as we transition to capitalism, this glimmer of the possibility of owning your own home kind of comes back into the fore, the sense that you're not just paying a kind of, you're not working specifically for a feudal lord, but you kind of abstract that process where you go to work and then you pay the landowner. But yeah, capitalism as a way to kind of keep itself going, has to then, negate its own negation. It has to reintroduce this idea of individual property. And for Marx, the interesting result of this could be, if individual property is universal, if everybody owns everything that they own, then you don't have individual property anymore. You have social ownership. Mm-hmm. So for Marx, in that sense, the negation of the negation, which we see capitalism doing, leads to socialism. But the problem then you get later on in the 20th century is there's already this awareness that this isn't quite going to go so smoothly. Capitalism has a tendency to, again, re-territorialize, to kind of to implement a certain drag on itself, to hold on to as much as it pushes and drives itself towards progress. So it doesn't, exceed its own bounds. It places a certain amount of drag so that it can remain in some sort of static form. And you see that now where, we don't necessarily have the idea of individual property is again being negated even further, so that now rent is kind of like a norm, not just in terms of you rent where you live, but you also rent culture. You have a Netflix subscription, a Spotify subscription, where you don't own any of the media that you're enjoying. You subscribe to access to it. And this sense of what some people, I think Peter Frey's calls this rentism, that this is one option of a post-capitalist future where, capitalism as this sort of a moment of tension completely dissipates and we just have this static rentism where you rent everything. And, that causes real problems for Marxism then. It brings to the fore this problem of agency, which is shared absolutely with accelerationism. Is it a case that we do nothing because the system's going to go a certain way on its own? Or is there a sense that, capitalism needs a bit of assistance from us to become something new? And that's a question that's asked in 2007, before the Accelerationist Reader, before most of the books are published on it. And that's a question that we're still arguing about.
Yeah, I mean, we can touch on conclusions because there's never really going to be a conclusion. What is your direction with that with respect to human agency actually being able to do something with capitalism?
I think personally, I'm on the side of that. We have to do something. I know this is, my sense is not quite so clear cut, but maybe comes from what Ray Brazier used to write in terms of his Prometheanism, whereas to say that his nihilistic vision of the universe is fundamentally a scientific one. Science increasingly reveals to us that nature is indifferent to us and, has no interest in our survival. Again, that's no longer just a nihilist position, but a realist position. But Brazier kind of points out that even if that's the case, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. As a species, we've always intervened in our own destiny through, inventions and scientific progressions that have, fundamentally changed how we understand these supposed givens of human existence, specifically birth, suffering, and death. We know that we're all going to be born, we're all going to suffer, and we're all going to die, but how horrific those experiences have changed radically even within the last 50 years. You're not born the same way as you once were. It's not quite as dangerous as it used to be. So those sorts of things are like, that's for Brazier is to say that the universe isn't different to us, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. It makes doing something an imperative. And I feel like, personally, I think that a response to capitalism is the same thing. We can acknowledge that capitalism is wholly indifferent to our survival, and that's precisely why it's up to us to, that gives us an imperative to do something. What that something is, I have no idea. It's interesting, I think, for me to sort of track how that very question has been going on for 15 years. And I think it's easy to say that the fact that it hasn't had an answer is quite depressing, but also, the fact that it hasn't had an answer and hasn't gone away, kind of shows that it's quite, it's a persistent question. That, again, a lot of accelerationist discourse at the moment kind of focuses on that and ridicules it. And it's like, well, yeah, we've been talking about this for 15 years. We're not unaware of this problematic. If anything, it's the core problem. And thinking about it is part of the imperative, right? To actually address this issue is a starting point. So yeah, that's how I feel anyway. And I hope, this side of the course gives a certain background as to why that is an imperative and should be.
Well, yeah, it does strangely mirror my side of the cause in the sense that with Deleuze, Deleuze and Guattari, they outline this sort of relatively, not watertight, but coherent system with respect to how schizophrenia works and how the schizophrenia takes a line of flight and with regards to the same and difference. But there's always this underlying question of, well, how does difference happen. It's sort of explain how it comes in and the mechanisms which allow that, and the alterations of time which allow that. But there's always this question of like, well, can we channel schizophrenia? Well, how do we get in contact with it? How do we actually use this? Because we're talking about this problem here with regards to, in philosophical terms, the same, right? It's like the return of the same, and that's the frustration. So what we're looking for is difference in itself, and this is the big question. I think it's almost the same question seen from two different angles, one political and one philosophical, which is, well, how the hell do we find and use the difference in itself? And, this is where I think this is probably why a lot of the CCRU's work can be considered accelerationist, is because they're sort of saying, well, things such as William Burroughs' cut-up technique, alternative means of doing philosophy, alternative ways of doing things and perceiving things, and to a certain extent sort of mind-altering drugs to a certain degree, or anything which is sort of altering your perception of reality, can allow difference in, but it's not controlled. And this is one of the problems is with, and this is why the question is still there, is because it's such a big question of, well, you can't just go out and go, I'm going to make something different, because I'm reminded of the Bergson thing of like when someone said to Henri Bergson, which, this came up in a recent chat, so I can't take credit for knowing this. Someone recently mentioned this to me, but someone said to Bergson, oh, you're an intellectual, you read a lot of books. What will the works, the big works in 20, 50, 100 years look like? And he said, well, if I knew, they'd already be done. And this is the problem which Lyotard outlines. And he says, well, if you have a frontier, if you have a limit, you no longer have a limit, because you understand, to have a limit, you have to understand both sides of a limit. So we're sort of stuck in this point of like, it's like a non-frontier. We understand there's this limit, but it's so elusive. It's like this non-limit which isn't there. So we almost need to find this way of definition or defining things, and then we can finally move beyond it. But it's this first limit which we can't move beyond, because something else is in control of how it moves. And this is there's the big problem which we've been talking about. So I think, like you said, it's sort of redundant when people say, oh, you've been struggling with this for years. It's sort of like saying, well, yeah, but people have been struggling with the meaning of, people have been struggling with epistemology for years. It's the same thing. It's
it's a big question, and big questions are good questions. I guess that's it, right? And and too often acceleration is reduced to a small question. But I think that came up in my side too. There was a definition that, I think especially for the early blogosphere, Lyotard's Libidinal Economy in particular is sort of acknowledged as like this great, the book of accelerationism, at least from the perspective of the 70s. And then there was a post that Mark Fisher wrote, sort of expounding on his love of that book, or his sort of perverse admiration for that book. No doubt from the influence of Nick Land at Warwick. And he has this definition where he says that capitalism is not really it's formless, but it's a name for attention, not attention, but a kind of tension, where we can understand this process of pure capitalism as a dissolution without limits, but at every step of the way, that process is in tension with inhibition. And how do you, if you manage to disarticulate the link between this dissolution without limits and inhibition, you get something new. And arguably, you don't even have capitalism anymore. You have something else. And that seems to be, he sort of frames that as being Lyotard's argument, that, to remove a sense of capitalism's own sense of its limitless limit, or limited limitlessness, when you remove that paradox, you kind of, you end up dealing with the kettle of fish. And that in itself is interesting, as if to truly have some new kind of defining process of social relation is enough of a starting point for a lot of those accelerationists, rather than it being, it doesn't necessarily have to be socialism or communism. Some kind of post-capitalism, some new form that we haven't seen before, is better than this stasis. And I think, politically, it's that same. It's that argument mirrored. If you know what it looks like, probably got less chance of getting there. I guess I was interested to know one of the things that is not so prevalent in my side, but which I was anticipating was prevalent for you, was this notion of time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is a difficult thing, because when we begin to talk about accelerationism, it's so caught up with the sociological context now and the political context, but the sort of non-philosophical political context, the everyday, mainstream, very quick news snippet type context, that it has sort of been removed from its, I would argue, home as a theory of time. It was sort of, dare I say it, originally a theorization of time, and it's a philosophy of time, and how time has this sort of strange pressure. And with, this is why I utilize Deleuze's three syntheses so much, is because that there's something very interesting in the way that they can actually compute how we're understanding accelerationism politically, even though I don't touch on this. But, just to think about Deleuze's first synthesis, where your present is simply the past retained and the future anticipated, but you're completely passive to it. That present is what you can sort of understand as the white supremacist understanding of accelerationism, or the 90s cyberculture. That's a single present, and in doing that, you're passive to it, and you're getting caught up in something which is still moving without you. It's moving you, but you're getting caught up in one single present. And then when you begin to look at the second synthesis and begin to have this aimed memory of looking back at these different nodes, that's when you can begin to understand that there is this differentiation. And once you can sort of step back from that and understand there's these modes where it's become different things at different times, well, then you can start to see, well, hang on, there must be some underlying thing which is actually controlling all of this, which is sort of what we're on about. And that's when the third synthesis comes in, which is really important, which I consider basically the entire structure of what it is to accelerate and what the actual process is the cut on the cyclic external return, where something different comes in and something new comes in. And we're sort of stuck in this weird conjunction where it's like, I would sort of push to say that very, very briefly, what Deleuze is arguing is that you have the Nietzschean eternal return, which is just a circle of time, which Deleuze sort of sees at certain points as the return of the same. So the same thing is returning, whether or not it's aesthetically different, we don't know. And there's this sort of strange stagnance with regard to the politics, is where it's very difficult to discern what's returning and in what sense, and whether or not something that's returning is the same or different. We're on about this stagnance, but everything seems so different. And this is why I think, when Deleuze says there's a cut on the eternal return, and this is the point where it starts to structure time. So if you cut the eternal return, you can have a before and then an after, and you suddenly have this event, and then you have a new future. And the point that I try to make is that with this third synthesis of Deleuze, where there's this cut, is that it must be in this that something temporal is happening with accelerationism, because to accelerate, you need this new future, and then you need another new future, which is all continuously accelerating. And obviously, if you think of the eternal return, when it's cut, it's sort of decentered from its circle, so it begins to spiral, which is how I understand Nick Land's time spirals. And there's just a lot of problems here with regards to the temporality of whether or not something that's returning is different, whether or not it's the same, and in what sense is there being a new future produced from the cut. And acceleration in that sense is the production of the future, and it's building upon these produced futures. But as as is clear at the moment, what's being produced seems to be caught up in something that's already happened on a political level. So that is, that's the temporal theory of it. And then, of course, with regards to the temporal theory, that connects quite directly to each political outlook. So the left accelerationism is, you can sort of run every form of political accelerationism through this towards what an almost preferred, like a time preference they would have, So the left accelerationism has this almost low time preference where they just want these relatively immediate technological innovations, which are one of the depressing things about left accelerationism, is that, like we were talking about limits and frontiers earlier, is that everything that they're envisioning which is going to emancipate people is actually already here, because it's like we could have UBI everywhere. So it's like we've already know conceptually what UBI is, so this isn't a future. And the same with automation, is like they're not thinking or conceptualizing of automation in any new way. It's like we could have more automated tills, or more jobs could be automated. So it's like you're still within this certain structure which we're stuck within, but people have this pseudo form of emancipation in it. So it's like this limit that they haven't gone beyond. So it's actually their futures are actually, as far as I'm concerned, present, because of the things they're on about are already here in certain forms. And I think that's probably key where the unconditional accelerationism and left accelerationism differ, is that the unconditional accelerationists are at least dealing with what isn't here yet, what hasn't arrived. And obviously, to a certain extent, right accelerationism, it's just touchy waters, isn't it? I mean, we don't.
Yeah.
I always put that just down to the singularity, but people have started renaming that the singularity accelerationism, Landian accelerationism, which I think is a bit more apt. As for right accelerationism, there needs to be an outline. But that's the temporal theory, really. I mean, does that connect in with what you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. A lot more than I expected, actually. Not expected from your side, but actually that's tweaked some things for me. That's kind of there's a chapter on the relationship between accelerationism and ontology, and it is essentially understanding them as a spiral, and essentially described. Really, there's a sense that Alex Williams once described ontology as a theory of good postmodernism, as if to say that the hauntology the hauntological moment in blogosphere was an attempt to describe how this negative feedback loop of the what was it Frederick Jameson called the cultural logic of late capitalism, this negative feedback loop suddenly starts to become positive, where these musicians and artists that are using, they're kind of enjoying their stasis, this kind of cultural dementia that we're going through, and in the process of trying to capture that feeling, they produce a new kind of creative moment. And then the strange irony again said earlier that in calling it hauntology, then the polarity, despite trying to emphasize the positivity of that feedback loop, in giving it a name, they kind of inverted the polarity and made it negative again, and people turned away from it. And accelerationism also seems to start the other way, where it starts off as affirming the positive feedback loop of late capitalism, at least the brief moments where it rears its head, and yet again in naming it, it goes negative. And then there's now this sort of struggle for the last sort of maybe 5-10 years to try and make it positive again. And I think, part of this naming process is an interesting one. People referring to, I think unconditional accelerationism is sometimes called Landian accelerationism. Alex Williams being the first person to actually try and provide a theory of accelerationism for 2007, referred to it as a left Landianism before taking the name from Benjamin Noyes. So in that sense, it's strange that this is something that it's shifted my own perspective on accelerationism in a way of sort of thinking that I've always been a card carrying unconditional accelerationist, and yet it's the sense of what kind of progress is that if we're going back to the start. Is it to sort of say, well, these questions, for me, I feel like a lot of the initial questions of accelerationism, politically speaking, have been obscured. No doubt, in part, Alex Williams' blog posts from 2007 would, I think, shock a lot of people now. When they are left, when it's said that it's a left Landianism, it's that in the most provocative sense. and he deleted most of them later on. You can only now access that blog via the Wayback Machine. But it's interesting to see that mode of accelerationism is then rejected, and left accelerationism, as we kind of know it, is sort of seen as a tempering of that initial moment of what I think someone called a kind of theoretical entrepreneurship on his part. And yeah, at every turn there seems to be a case of people accidentally killing projects they're trying to embolden, or inadvertently emboldening the projects that they want to dismiss. And there's all these paradoxes caught up, but again, it's like it's this interesting. What I find this interesting problem where there needs to be a certain level of hubris where any person that is working with accelerationism, it's not to say that because you or I have an interest in understanding these dynamics, we're somehow above them. There's this kind of really frustrating sense that the more that you become aware of these dynamics, the more you see them undermining your own project sort of before you can even, get to a kind of settled, or not even settled, but a kind of really, a propulsive conclusion. And I find that more interesting, maybe because I'm a masochist, but I find that a lot more interesting than depressing.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, with my original thesis and with my lectures, is that once again I begin from the human, which is sort of a strange thing for a continental to do, because continental usually begins from conditions. But for me, it was actually more interesting, and this is like probably my disagreement with Land, is that I still think that the human is important in relation to the process. I think it's silly to say otherwise. You could, of course, argue that, well, it's just that the human is the most important capital asset that it has, right? But I think, beginning from the human and moving out is like, and that I understand the human as the smallest kernel which we can understand accelerationism from, and I think beginning from the conditions, beginning from how accelerationism is in itself, is sort of silly, because you can't understand that without understanding how it's pulling our strings, because we have to assess it in a Kantian mode from like, we can only understand it. Once again, it's almost like a new way of understanding the thing in itself, but in a different format. So we have to understand it in that manner. And yeah, I just think that's, Land said something which I really, really loved, with regards to what you were saying about when you're doing these projects, it masochistically, you realise that acceleration is there all the time and it's coming in. And one of the really sort of, now I think of it, very morbid things that Land says is that this is in Fang Numena, from one of his really old essays. He says, we're doing things before they make sense. And that's basically what we have to do now. It's like, if something you're doing is making sense, it's already within this. So this was, for me, that quote sort of encapsulates where we might be able to begin to find accelerationist praxis. We're doing things before they make sense. You almost like have to do what Land was doing in Warwick, which is just let yourself be overtaken by the flows of sort of whatever it is you want to be overtaken by, and commune with the outside, let the outside in. And then we come back to the question of how the hell do we do that? So yeah. Sorry, you were going to say?
No, I mean, that's really interesting. Because I was going to say, I guess to the first half of what you were saying, the part of one question that comes up briefly in my side of the course is, how we can actually define capitalism. I mean, in terms of like categorizing it, is it the result of human, is it just the product of human greed, or is it a purely inhuman process? Is it human or is it inhuman? Is it natural? Is it unnatural? And part of the very, the difficulty of trying to deal with capitalism, I think, is because it does kind of slip between those kinds of understandings and the kind of at various different levels. But yeah, I think that's part of how, it's a kind of like the starting point for the course for me, which I was actually very surprised by. I'd never expected to start in this moment was with Elaine Badiou, who I'd not really read too much of before actually starting the research for this project. But I found, there's a lot of the initial speculative realist philosophies that were kind of a precursor to accelerationism in a way, took what his charge very seriously, which was that, philosophy has always philosophy doesn't exist on its own. It doesn't progress. It doesn't. We don't have philosophical progress by philosophy's own merits. It doesn't move just through its own activities alone. And he has these like 4 pillars that surround philosophy and influence it, and that philosophy influences in turn, which are science, politics, art, and love. And which I'd kind of just interpret. I mean, I don't know what he means by love. I guess that's kind of like intersubjective kind of understandings. But, he says that in every turn, a new philosophy has been needed to birth a new science. So he points to like Plato in mathematics, Hegel and Marx in history, Nietzsche, Bergson and Deleuze in biology. Each of these major figures in philosophy have helped, fundamentally change how we view a certain type of science. And so he says that, there's a new philosophy needed now that can, help us come to terms with this beast called capitalism. That, as you say, we're doing things before we understand them. We don't really, as much as, Karl Marx left as this mammoth unfinished work of Capital that seems to, predict and describe capitalism's dynamics in kind of incredibly prescient detail, we nevertheless kind of don't understand its effect on us as subjects, on the world at large, on our perceptions of reality and time. It's as if to say that in a way we have new sciences at our disposal that are helping us come to terms with this. Our sort of new cosmic perspective on the planet Earth kind of allows us this newly inhuman view of our own activities. Things like quantum mechanics, give us a better understanding of contingency, I guess. But, where's the philosophy that kind of combines these new scientific developments in a way that actually, complements these new perspectives of ourselves and the planet that we live on? And he doesn't seem to think that exists yet, not in a way that it has done for these other developments. And it's, the speculative realists take up this charge very seriously. And it seems to me, at least from the research that I've been doing, that accelerationism was one way of doing this. It was a way of looking at capitalism in itself, to try and bring about, to kind of almost hyperstition into existence this idea of a pure capitalism that's kind of this phantasmatic figure that doesn't really have any definition, but maybe the very idea of it is what can, bring it into existence. And that again, in encouraging this separation between the human and capitalism, by kind of, exacerbating that sense of alienation that we have, new modes of thinking, new philosophies literally might, emerge from that process. And I guess now I've kind of lost where my original point was from your question. I was getting on a tangent.
I was on about the human subject.
Right. Yeah. So like being able to separate, being able to actually understand what capitalism is doing to us. Maybe that can, inaugurate a new way of thinking, about how we can act for ourselves without capitalism. As if to say, encouraging capitalism to go off and be its own thing is in some senses seen as just like, it's just to stop pretending that we're holding on to any sort of leash. Again, it's the sort of Promethean thing to acknowledge that we have no control over this strange economic system. Doesn't necessarily, is no abdication of responsibility. Rather, it means that we should, we should stop trying to be responsible for the system and actually take responsibility for ourselves. In that sense, the acceleration of the human subject alongside the acceleration of capitalism, both those processes can be disentangled. And that's kind of something that comes up in the course too, this cultural sense that, technologically capitalism is progressing at an alarming rate. But culturally, it's as if we kind of hate this speed. We hate the fact that a new iPhone comes out every year or something. So we do a certain amount of drag on that system culturally. I make the example of video games. The fact that I think I've bought 4 video games this year, and all of them are remakes from like the 1990s. And having this sense that, it's actually quite nice to just see something to we have a desire for the familiar, and I don't think that's necessarily a reactionary, like a part of reactionary nature. It's just to say that that technology is accelerating far faster than our memories are. So that it's actually the familiar is far more fleeting than the new. So we hold on to the familiar rather than kind of embracing the potentials that might come from this rapidly accelerating technology that is far exceeding our bounds. Being able to actually get familiar with new products before the new one comes along. If we can detach capitalism from that very, that our need for whatever that emotion's called, that need for nostalgia, that frees us up as well.
Okay. I think that's a good place to finish up with the chat. If we just say a few things about the course. So the course, as I said, should be coming out this Friday on the 24th. So there's going to be 10 lectures. So I've got 3 lectures, but mine are a bit longer than Matt's. So I've got about 3.5 hours of content, and Matt's got about 5 hours. So you're looking over 8 hours of content, 10 lectures in total. With the transcripts. So then the pricing is going to be, just for those course materials, be £100 for those course materials and a seminar, which there'll be 4 dates put up, all on weekends. One session at roughly 10 a.m. GMT and one at about 7 p.m. GMT. 2 of them each. That'll be £150 for that one, and then for all of that plus a 1-on-2 with me and Matt, it'll be £200. So this promo video will be going on YouTube on the Tuesday, and then I'll put the links in the description for those interested in the course after the fact, once it's released. But it will also be on about it and sharing it on Twitter and all social media and things like that. So if there's something that interests you, or you want to enroll in, just find the links, or if you have any questions, then feel free to message me or Matt. So it's MetaNomad on Twitter, or is it Xenogothic on Twitter?
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to add?
No, just it sounds great. I'm really looking forward to doing this, and excited for more accelerationist chats with even more people.
Okay. See you guys there.